Well, hello again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and thanks for joining me once again. Now, we've just recently returned from the two-day Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and I'd just like to say a quick hello to everybody I met at the show over the course of the 2 days. Nice to meet some of the old YouTube subscribers, and thanks again for your appreciation of my video channel. Now, we did come across quite a few machines over the course of the 2 days, so there's quite a lot of footage and bikes to sort through, but we'll get to it as soon as we can, and I hope you enjoy all of the episodes from this year's Classic Dirt Bike Show. So we're going to dive straight in here now with episode 1 of possibly 6 or maybe even 7 episodes from the show. So let's dive straight into our first batch of bikes, and let's take a look. Right, so first up we have a rather tasty looking Baco Trials bike here, and this machine here is a 1975 Sammy Miller Highboy 325, and these first selection of bikes are just some of the lucky ones that I managed to capture on the Friday afternoon, and that was of course prior to the opening of the show for real on the Saturday. And actually this is the perfect time to film these bikes, because there's usually plenty room to work around them, because the exhibitors are usually in the process of just setting them up, because once they're all in position and then fenced off, then you've absolutely no chance of getting a good shot. But again, that was one of the things that I did notice at Telford this year, that there seemed to be quite an abundance of trials bikes this time round, and although I'm not really a trials man myself, there were still some superb looking trials bikes on display. So we're going to feature quite a few of them as we wind our way through the various episodes of this year's show. Although I must say that this little Baco Highboy here is certainly a little belter, and a credit to the owner, who's obviously spent quite a lot of time and money getting this bike into what can only be described as better than brand new condition. Now, don't quote me here, because as I said, trials bikes aren't really my speciality, but I'm pretty sure it was the great Sammy Miller who designed these Highboy frames, which of course were really designed to give the rider extra ground clearance here under the motor. But these Baco two-stroke motors were, as you know, excellent power plants for their day, and they were not only used for these trials bikes, but also put to good use on their Pursang motocrossers as well. But you can see that this is frame number 501, or SM 501 for Sammy Miller, and I expect that these front forks as well will be those Spanish beater units, which are more or less the same forks that were fitted to the Baco motocrossers of their day. But the general finish on this bike is absolutely fantastic, and I don't even remember these bikes looking this good back in 1975, but I do remember that the tank and the combined side panels on these trials bikes were all originally formed in fiberglass in that year, and naturally it was a much slimmer fuel tank on these trials bikes than the Pursang motocrossers of their day, because this, after all, is a trials bike where everything has to be slim, neat and tidy when you're standing up on the pegs. But for being one of the very first bikes that I came across on the Friday afternoon, I was certainly well impressed with this machine, and if this was the kind of quality of the bikes that we're going to see at this year's show, then I just couldn't wait to see what was next on the list. And in fact, as it happened, the very next bike that I spied was this old school vintage BSA Goldstar Scrambler, a proper man's race bike from the early 1960s, and the British-built Goldies, of course, were the staple diet for many of the UK's best riders away back in the day, and these vintage Goldstars and many other British classics like the Greaves and HISs and many others were pounding the UK's racetracks in the 1950s and 60s when scrambling, as it was known then, it was broadcast live by the BBC on their grandstand TV show on a Saturday afternoon. And again, as you know, these big Goldie four-stroke motors were big, powerful beasties for their time, and between that tubular steel chassis and this quite heavy single-cylinder power plant, you certainly needed to have the build of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the determination of the great big Bob Wright to muscle one of these Goldies around the racetrack. Now, I did notice that this particular motor here had quite an unusual carburetor fitted to the engine, and it wasn't one that I was quite familiar with up until a more knowledgeable BSA passerby pointed out that this little square receptacle was actually the float chamber for the carburetor, which I think was called a matchbox float chamber for obvious reasons. And this carb here was some kind of upmarket works item, but as I said, not a carburetor that I've seen before. But that's a great thing about the Classic Dirt Bike TV channel. Even I can learn little bits of knowledge as we continue to look deeper into these old school classics. Although when you take a look at these big heavy BSA engines, you have to admire those guys who rode these bikes on scrambled tracks back in the 1950s and 60s, because not only were these quite heavy machines, the suspension systems that they fitted to these bikes were still more or less unmodified road bike suspensions, and their travel was kind of limited to maybe just a few inches. But that was what they had to work with back then, and you can't have anything but respect for what these guys had to go through riding these awesome big four-stroke classics. But certainly a beautiful old classic from the 1950s and 60s, and just one of many classics that were at this year's 2024 show. But this was another very nice Bultaco that I managed to grab just before it was locked into the lineup, and this was Andy Priest's 1974 Mark 8 360 Persang. Another absolutely immaculate machine, as you can see, and I must say these Bultaco guys certainly know how to look after a bike, because this one here once again is in almost showroom fresh condition. Now, with regards that rear stand on the bike, there's no way that stand is going to give way under the bike's weight, because it's made of solid rebar, which, as you know, is more commonly used for reinforcing concrete. But in this case here, it's being made to support another kind of classic foundation. So moving on again to the Bultaco's engine, which is just a conventional piston port two-stroke with that big Amol carburetor there to feed it with its fuel. But these 74 360s were just an absolute peach of an engine, and the engine's casings, triple clamps, and of course the hubs on the wheels all came direct from the factory in this very highly polished kind of state. Now, the sparks for these Mark 8 360s were all supplied by a FEMSA ignition system, and they say that these 74 Persangs were almost identical to the bike that the great Jim Pomeroy rode to victory when he won the Spanish 250 Grand Prix back in 1973. And again, you can see, and as in our previous Bultaco Trials bike, you can see that the bike's fuel tank and side panels and even the mudguards were all made of fiberglass for this bike back in 1974, which of course was prior to plastic taking over the motocross world. But Andy's bike here appears to still have all of the Spanish goodies that were bolted onto it at Bultaco HQ in that year, because it was these beater forks on the front and beater rear shocks that the factory used on these Mark 8s and some of the other models from the 1970s. And as you can expect, these beaters were about as basic as you could get, but unfortunately this was the suspension technology of its day, because there wasn't really much of an alternative in that year. Although nevertheless, once you got these little Bultacos all set up nicely with regards ignition, suspension and carb settings, and you put the right rider in the saddle, then these European-made motorcycles could certainly give a good account of themselves on the racetrack, even when they were racing alongside the might of the big four Japanese manufacturers. But without question, this is a superb example of one of these Mark 8 360s from 1974, and a credit to its owner, Andy Priest, who put it together. Now, next up, it's another Italian stallion, and this time here it's a quite rare 1976 MotoGory GS Injo 250, powered by a Sachs 7-speed two-stroke engine. Now, MotoGory were another one of the smaller Italian motorcycle manufacturers that I think they began in the late 1960s up until I think it was around 1983, and they initially began by building small 50cc off-road bikes to eventually going on to build bigger motocross and enduro bikes, such as our machine here with the German-made Sachs motor. But MotoGory also used power plants from Rotax, Minarelli, Hyro and Moto Marini in their earlier years. But these 250 MotoGory enduro bikes had this kind of yellow theme, while their other motocross models that used the more popular Rotax two-stroke engine were coloured in green livery. But as I remember, it was the other Italian bike builder, SWM, who eventually bought into MotoGory, which then led to them changing their name to simply Gory. But there's no mistaking that these little Sachs 250 engines were quite powerful for their day, and as I said, they had this 7-speed gearbox, which certainly kept your feet busy dancing up and down on that gear shifter. And because this was a 7-speeder, occasionally it could be a bit troublesome in the gearbox department from time to time, due to its 2 transmission shafts and a pair of complicated idler gears that made up the 7 speeds. But in terms of the motor's power and its quickness, this Sachs engine was still a ballistic missile. And so here at the back end of our Gory, more Italian-based parts with these quite radical-looking Corti Cosso piggyback shocks, which, although they look high-tech and ahead of their time for the mid-1970s, these were still very basic dampers for their day that had very little in the way of adjustment or tuning, but they certainly had that Italian styling, that's for sure. And when we take a look here at the front end
of our Enduro 250. I'm pretty sure that it would have been more Italian-based parts, and these forks on this bike could maybe even be a set of Marzoccis or something similar, but these forks here are not a make or model that I instantly recognise with these kind of squared off machining on the fork legs. But here at the rear we have a substantial tailpipe or silencer, just to enable the bike to comply with all of the relevant road traffic laws, just in case the bike does take to the highway. And the fuel tank on our Gory here is more than likely made of alloy, but the green liveried Goro motocrossers of their time used plastic fuel cells, as I remember. So although MotoGory did build some quite nice bikes during their short production life, they were just another small manufacturer who could never seem to compete with the volume and the variety of bikes that were being imported from Japan in the 1970s and early 80s. And it wouldn't be too long before the likes of MotoGory and some of the other Italian-based bike builders would then succumb to the might of the Japanese invasion. Okay, so next up it's another super rare CCM classic, and this bike here is Rob Hughes' 1991 CCM 605cc double overhead cam Rotax racer. So my intention is just to do a full length video on this bike at a later date, so just for now we'll have a quick look around the bike and some of its parts. Now, the frame for this machine was actually purchased by Rob Hughes back in 1998, and at that time the frame had a stock single-cylinder Rotax 4-stroke motor sitting inside it. But Rob and his bike building pal Alec Middleton then noticed that there were additional engine mounting points on the chassis that weren't being used, so they then contacted the late Alan Clues for a bit more information, whereby Alan then told them that this chassis was actually built to take the prototype twin cam Rotax engine, and it was originally his son Austin Clues' race bike at that time. Now, as you would expect, Rob and Alec then asked Alan Clues why this bike still had the old school single cam Rotax motor in the chassis, and Alan told them that once they'd bolted in the new double overhead cam Rotax engine, it was then tested by the great Perry Leask, who found that the power delivery wasn't exactly what was expected, and the additional weight and the bulkiness at the top end didn't really outweigh the advantages of the extra 10 or so horsepower that the engine delivered. So they then just took the engine out and swapped it for a tuned up single overhead cam motor, which Perry Leask then raced during 1992. And so, as you can see, this big bruiser of an engine is quite a formidable lump sitting here inside this custom-made CCM Works chassis, and I expect it would have needed quite some effort to throw this big bike around a racetrack. But another unusual feature of this double overhead cam Rotax engine was that it had 3 spark plugs, which I'm led to believe all fired at exactly the same time. And as far as I know, the thinking behind this triple spark plug was to make sure that all of the fuel that was pumped into that single cylinder engine was burnt completely, ensuring a full and complete burn of the gases, and hopefully more power eventually at the rear wheel. And in fact, it's also said that this double overhead cam motor had a pair of 40mm Delorto carburetors originally, so you can understand why it had to have that triple spark ignition just to help burn the sea of fuel that was pouring into this huge Rotax power plant. But as like many of the other CCMs from the 1990s, it was a good quality pair of white power suspensions that were used here on the front, and at the rear of this Clues Classic, it was just a single monoshock white powered unit here at the back. And as I remember, this did have quite a bit of scope for adjustment to the rebound and the damping. And it was also a quite strong but well-built alloy swing arm on the back of this CCM, which had, I think it was a Grimeka twin pot brake here at the back. Although, as I said, we're going to take a look at this very rare bike in much closer detail in the not-too-distant future when we do a full video on the history and the parts that are fitted onto this Clues Classic. But yet again, this is another part of the CCM racing history that takes pride of place in the Rob Hughes Classic CCM collection. Oh, and just before we go, another little bit of information on how rare and interesting this bike was over the course of the 2 days of the show, because the judges awarded it the best motocross machine and the best bike in the show. So again, another big well done to Alec Middleton, who put the bike together, and of course to Rob Hughes, the owner of the machine. Right, okay, just to finish off our episode 1 from the 2024 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. This is Ed Willett's very nice 1972 TM400 Suzuki. Now, as I remember, I think these used to be called the Cyclones back in the day, and this was said to be Suzuki's first ever mass-produced motocross off-roader of that time. Now, these Suzukis did have a relatively light tubular steel chassis, and of course that pretty wild and scary two-stroke 400 engine. But although Ed's Suzuki here is maybe not a fully 100% original bike from that year, this is probably as close as you're ever going to get to an original version of this 42-year-old race machine. So the engine on this bike was a simple piston port two-stroker, although it never actually ran on pre-mixed fuel, because these little Suzukis had a separate oil tank for the two-stroke oil that was usually hidden behind that right-hand side panel on the bike. And on the transmission side, it was a wet oil-cooled multi-plate clutch that had this kind of front facing lever to operate the clutch, and inside the motor it was a 5-speed gearbox as well. Now, fuel was usually fed through a 34mm carburetor, and the engine also had PEI electronic ignition to supply all the sparks to make the engine go. But allegedly, these old TM400 engines kicked out around, I think it was the 40 horsepower mark, which wasn't really that bad for a 400cc power plant, but the complete Cyclone package of the frame and the engine made it quite a difficult beast to tame. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that these bikes were often listed as one of the most dangerous motocrossers of its day because of its evil handling and its kind of light switch motor that experts actually put down to the way that the ignition was initially set up at the factory, because it was designed using full retard for easy starting, and when riding the bike it would just simply jump from full retard to full advance and then take off like the proverbial missile. So you can understand why it was that these engines were so unpredictable, to which of course many riders found out to their cost when trying to ride them. And here at the front end of our TM400, some of the reviews on these forks weren't really that great either in 1972. Some people say they were just far too soft and spongy for a bigger 400cc bike. But these old school drum brakes actually worked reasonably well, and these were certainly capable of slowing the bike down if it wanted to try yet another one of its rocket ship takeoffs. But these kind of upswept exhausts were certainly a stock fitting on these 72 bikes, although naturally this one here of Ed's isn't the original pipe, but a pattern replacement from Gemco exhaust systems, which is very similar to the standard 72 pipe. Once more, the original shocks on the back here have been changed for something a bit more up to date, but still in keeping with the classic age of the bike. And although I'm not entirely sure as to what make and model these shocks are, they have certainly still got that old school classic look to them, and these will probably be a lot better than the 1972 originals. But as I said earlier, no need to put your premix oil and gas into this tank, because Suzuki had their own oil and gas in separate tanks, and they use a little oil pump that they call their CCI lubrication system, whereby oil from the pump is injected directly into the left-hand main bearing and into the intake ports to lubricate the conrod bearing, piston and needle bearing, and of course the cylinder wall as well. And the oil from that lubrication was housed in this little plastic tank here that was hidden behind the right-hand side panel of the bike. But I certainly do remember the earlier 1971 TM400 Cyclone Suzukis, which also never had a great reputation for their handling and scary power of that engine, because I'm sure that these 72 bikes used much the same power plant, although the earlier 71 Suzukis would have had orange type of fuel tanks and side panels as opposed to the stock standard yellow. But don't get me wrong here, I'm not knocking Ed's bike, far from it, because although the earlier Cyclones from 71 and maybe even these 72 bikes never actually covered themselves in glory in the early 1970s, because early attempts were really just a bit of a Suzuki test bed where they could learn from these much earlier off-road bikes, so that they could then go on to compete on the world stage against their fiercest rivals of Honda, Kawasaki and Yamaha. So there you have it. That's the first batch of machines from the 2024 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. And of course there are many more episodes and bikes
to follow in future videos, and if you'd like to be notified as soon as I upload one of those videos, and it's just a simple case of subscribing to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and that way you won't miss out on any future videos that I upload from this event. But thanks again for tuning in to my CDB TV channel. Hope to see you again very soon so we can talk about more of these old school classics from this year's 2024 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show.